Chapter 16. For the King. Lannis moved swiftly along the ridge which extended out into the valley above the path. The tree-covered top of the ridge was broad and gently rolling. From the castle wall the ground sloped gradually upward to a crest of a low rise, then dipped into a small valley. Then it rose again on a long slope to the wind-swept tip of the ridge where the stone tower was located. As Lannis crossed the little valley at a trot, he saw halfway up this slope the glow of his comrade's sword stretched in a battle line under the trees. The line was quiet as he approached. Lannis made his way toward the center of the line, where he knew Jamin would be, and there he found him standing under a tree with a small group of soldiers. Jamin greeted him warmly but soberly. "I'm glad you're back," he said. "It looks as though we'll need every sword tonight." "What is the situation?" asked Lannis breathlessly. "We're not sure exactly," said Jamin slowly. "It's not just a local attack. For the first time our enemies have found a way up the cliffs from the valley and, this afternoon, swept over the tower with nearly their whole strength. Of course, they now control the path as well. We've stopped them here on the ridge only with difficulty, and I expect another attack in a few minutes. We've drawn as many men as we can from the castle and from the outpost, and we will try to hold them at this point." Just then there was a stir in the battle line, and Jamin said, "Get ready, Lannis, quickly! They are coming again. You will fight beside me for the time being." He turned away and called an order. Lannis just had time to take off his traveling cloak when the trumpet sounded again, and the flaring of sword lights along the line told them that the enemy was advancing. At the same time the now familiar wailing sound was heard, but louder and more terrifying than Lannis had ever heard it. Then came the evil ones. They seemed larger than they had ever been, and they were armed with heavy, flaming darts. They came forward with a rush among the trees, striking the king's line along its whole length and driving it backwards down the slope. "For the king!" cried Lannis, leaping in to rally his men, and with a shout the line held again. Lannis went into the battle at Jamin's side and found himself set upon by two of the evil ones. But as he was driven backward, another of the king's soldiers appeared at his side, and together they repelled the attack. Then the king's men surged forward in a countercharge, and the line of battle swung back again, nearly to where it had been before. But more and more of the enemy's strength was thrown into the fray, and once again Jamin and his men were forced backwards, toward the trees, toward the small valley. Never had Lannis been in a battle of such fierceness. The minutes stretched into hours, and still the fight raged, with the weary soldiers of the king battling ever fresh waves of the enemy reinforcements. Back and forth surged the battle line, but the backward movement were always the longer, so that, as the night wore on, the king's men were pushed, foot by foot, across the little valley and up the rise overlooking the castle itself. As the morning mist began to form on the slopes, there was a lull in the fight. Lannis, panting with weariness, leaned on his sword and looked over the field. The line was thinner now, and there were many gaps where brave men had fallen. But the ground in front was carpeted with the bodies of their enemies. Lannis looked at the face of the soldier who had been fighting next to him, and saw with surprise that it was Robin. The two friends smiled at each other wearily. "Where did Jamin go?" asked Lannis. "He went to the left to steady the line," said Robin. "Here he comes now." Jamin's armor was stained, his face was gray and tired, and he had been wounded slightly on the left arm, but he smiled at the two lads as calmly as though nothing were wrong. "They will be at us again in a few moments," he said, answering their unspoken question. "They have just stopped to regroup. There is no question about it. This is their whole army, and an all-out attack. I have called for the detachment guarding our rear to join us in our stand here, as well as the few soldiers left in the castle. We must hold them on this hill." "What is the enemy's plan?" Jamin asked Lannis. "They must mean to drive us back against the castle walls and destroy us entirely," said Jamin in a matter-of-fact voice. "We could save ourselves now by withdrawing into the castle, but then they would hold both the ridge and the path to the valley, and it is our duty to keep the way open to the valley until the king comes again, so that others may come to know him." Robin, who had been peering through the mist, said quietly, "Here they come again." Sword lights were flaring high along the king's line, and the grim-faced soldiers were closing their ranks and tightening their battle harnesses for a determined stand. Then up through the mist, with their wailing cry, came the evil ones, rank on rank, under cover of a shower of darts. As the main assault struck the king's line, still another force attacked from the side, so that the line of soldiers was forced backwards in a curve. For a long moment of furious hand-to-hand fighting, the line held, strengthened by the small garrison from the castle, which then came into the fight. But then the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. Lannis felt himself being driven backward to the very crest of the rise. Then, in spite of Jamin's heroic efforts to rally them, the king's soldiers, still fighting fiercely, were swept over the crest and down the slope towards the castle wall. There, against the wall, the retreat stopped, for there was nowhere else to go. This was the final stand. With backs against the wall and shields close in front of them, the soldiers of the king stood, prepared to fight to the last man. No room was there to swing their swords. It was the point or nothing. So they thrust and parried and thrust again until their arms were numb with weariness. Lannis and Robin fought shoulder to shoulder, silently but with grim determination. Next to them stood Jamin, his tireless sword flashing out terrible retaliation against foe after foe. Farther down the line, standing firm as the very stones of the wall itself, were John and Waver and Dell. How long they stood there, beating off charge after charge of the desperate enemy, Lannis never knew. But finally, just as he began to feel that he could no longer hold up his weapons, the pressure slackened. The evil ones were withdrawing. A moment later, the last of the attackers had gone, and the area along the wall was quiet, except for the sobbing gasps of the exhausted soldiers. Lannis slumped weakly to the ground at the foot of the wall. He was bleeding from several cuts which he had not even felt in the heat of the battle, and neither Robin nor Jamin were in better condition. As the beaten, helpless remnants of the king's army rested, the first streaks of gray morning light touched the castle turrets. In front of them, the white morning mist now shrouded the entire slope. Lannis stared into it, dazed and unseeing. Was this the end of the king's cause? Was it for this that he had left the valley and entered the king's service? Was the road from the valley to freedom to be forever sealed to the Lannises and Hendas and Farmer Broadleafs, who wished for a better hope than the valley offered? Suddenly Lannis became aware that the area near the top of the ridge was becoming darker and more sinister. Black patches of fog appeared in strips, hanging like tattered curtains against the whiteness of the mist. It reminded him of something that he had seen before somewhere. Painfully, his tired brain tried to recall it. Then in a flash he remembered. The black fog. The black, deadly fog of the Valley of Despair. He turned his head. Jamin was sitting a few feet away, his head buried in his hands. Jamin, look! They've brought the blackness of darkness with them! Jamin raised his head and looked for a long moment up the slope to where the black curtains were spreading noiselessly across the hilltop. So, he said at last, that is the plan. They want not only to close the valley road, but to spread their own deadly atmosphere around the king's castle itself. He dropped his head again. We must rest now while we can, he said. They will come once more to destroy us before the fog separates us from them completely. Again Lannis sat silently watching the fog. But his mind went back to the Valley of Despair and the fight against the force of the evil there. Then the three of them, Jamin and Robin and Lannis, had defeated the strongest of the evil ones in their own valley. Why was it now that the king's soldiers were beaten in the very shadow of the king's castle? Lannis looked at his sword as it lay beside him. He recalled how in the Valley of Despair this blade had seemed to fight of its own accord, how it had led him forward, defending him against attack, and how it had sought out unerringly the weak points in his opponent's armor. Why was it that this same sword was being driven back in defeat? And the answer came to him. The sword was not defeated. It was only men who had been driven backward, only men who had been beaten. Each stroke of the sword had been true and deadly, but the legs under it had faltered and given way. No, the sword of the king was not defeated. It was still quick and powerful and sharper than any other. As long as earnest hearts and legs and arms would carry it forward, the sword of the Spirit would ever be, invincible. Lannis remembered how, in the king's great book, soldiers of the king had battled in days gone by. He remembered Paul standing alone, sword in hand, while the city of Athens mocked. He remembered Daniel, who stood with the sword against the force of evil in his day. And he remembered Joshua, who in a time of great peril for the king's forces had stood forth for the king with these words, "Choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." These were high points in the lives of the king's soldiers. These were times when the king strengthened them and guided their arms to victory. There were other times when, because of the weakness of man, the king's banners were driven back in defeat, but it was not for soldiers of the king to question. The king, invisible, powerful, tender, and kind, was looking over the scene with his all-seeing eyes. The sword was the king's weapon. Lannis was only its bearer. All this came to Lannis in an instant as he sat looking at his sword, and he knew what his duty was. Lannis must stand for the king. He would go forward. Under the eye of the King of Kings he would, alone if necessary, carry the sword forward against the king's enemies so long as his legs would move. Slowly, painfully, Lannis struggled to his feet. He was tired with a terrible weakness, and his legs and arms trembled, but he forced his body to stand upright facing his enemies. He stood there, swaying, fighting for strength. He said no words, but several of the soldiers slumping nearby against the wall looked up at him wondering as he tightened his helmet strap with fumbling fingers and lifted his shield. Then he raised his sword. The hilt was warm to the touch, warmer than it had ever been, and the sword was feather light. As he raised it, Lannis felt a strength that was not his own flowing into his limbs, and then something happened. The blade of the sword itself began to shine with a strange light as though it had been heated white-hot in a furnace. Many times brighter than the usual glow which came from the sword was this shining, and it flashed from the blade like a flame of fire. Beside him, he heard Robin struggle to his feet. "Jammin," cried Robin, "look! Look at Lannis's sword!" Jammin raised his head. "The shining sword," he breathed. "I've seen it at last." Slowly, as in a trance, Jammin rose and drew his own sword, and at once it too began to glow with a flaming light. Then Robin's shaking hand found his sword pommel, and a moment later a shining sword flashed in his hand as well. And all along the wall, startled faces of soldiers were turned towards the three as they stood in the unearthly light. Jammin said, wondering, "Many times in the hands of men of old the sword has shone, but never have I ever heard of more than one shining at the same time." And Lannis, his eyes glowing, answered, "It is our king's way of showing us that his sword will never fail, though heaven and earth pass away." All along the line now, tired soldiers were getting to their feet, and as each man drew his sword, it began to shine until the whole line was aflame with light that none had seen before. Then Jammin stepped out and turned to face his comrades. "Soldiers of the king," he said simply, "let us go forward. Breathe against the blade when you pass through the black fog, then drive against the enemies with the point and the edge, and let us not stay our hands until the evil ones are driven over the cliffs at the edge of the ridge." There were no words in answer, but Lannis, looking down the line, saw tired faces lit with new strength and hope. Then Jammin turned towards the enemy and raised his sword, and the silver trumpet sounded. From end to end, the whole line of shining swords, borne by the king's soldiers, surged out from the wall, forward up the hill. As they went, someone began singing one of the king's marching songs. Other voices joined in, and in a moment, the praises of the king were rolling out in a great swelling chorus. And Lannis, marching confidently forward, knew that the battle was already won, had been won from the instant when, casting self aside, he had truly dedicated his life to bearing the king's sword. There might be other battles for Lannis, but it would not be Lannis who fought them. Battles would be fought and won by the King of Kings. Lannis would only carry forward the king's sword. Perhaps in one of those battles the sword would again shine in as a flame in Lannis's hand. Perhaps not. That was not for him to know. He would march as one of the vast number of nameless men from ages past to ages present have marched, under the king's banner, and bearing the ageless sword. For unto them the king has said, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. Forward up the hill go the king's soldiers, though the white mist swirls blot out the view. And we stand, you and I, in the grey light by the towering castle wall, and watch them go. Ahead of them hangs the black curtains of darkness, and beyond it waits the enemy. But the line of shining swords moves steadily on, and victory is in the sound of the tramping feet. Somewhere near the center of that line, you and I can no longer tell in the mist which one he is, marches Lannis, young man of the valley, soldier of the King of Kings, and bearer of the king's own sword.